This is the American Law Journal.
A year ago, the American Psychological Association said we prescribe too many psychotropic drugs, especially for children. More recently, the American Psychiatric Association said pretty much the same thing. Why the change now? And do lawyers have anything to do with it? Good evening. I'm attorney Christopher Naughton. Welcome to the American Law Journal. Four guests with me tonight. Let's go ahead and meet them. Stephen Scheller hails from Scheller PC in practice since the late 1970s. He's a plaintiff's attorney representing individuals harmed by dangerous drugs. His firm has been at the forefront of pharma whistleblower litigation, including a $2.2 billion settlement against Johnson & Johnson just months ago over the antipsychotic drug Risperdal. Dr. Barbara Ziv joins our program for the first time tonight, a forensic psychiatrist, a member of the faculty at Temple University Medical School. She speaks and lectures extensively about the overprescription of medication. She's testified in over 140 trials. Terry Henry joins us again. Commercial litigator with Blank Rome, representing medical device and pharmaceutical companies. And he's written in the National Law Journal regarding the pressure on drug and device manufacturers to quickly report on adverse events. And Matt Harman is with us from the CNN studios in Atlanta, Georgia tonight, former defense counsel for King and Spalding, and now more recently, switching hats, a plaintiff's attorney with Harman Law in Atlanta, Georgia. Let me go to you first, Doc. Again, this is the Choosing Wisely program from the American Psychiatric Association. 5 things physicians and patients should question. It was just published in the New England Journal of Medicine just months ago. And let me just go through them very quickly. Don't prescribe antipsychotics without appropriate initial evaluation and ongoing monitoring. Number 2, don't routinely prescribe 2 of these drugs at once. Don't use it as a first choice for dementia. Don't use it as a first-line intervention for insomnia. And don't use antipsychotics as a first-line intervention for children for anything other than psychiatric disorders. I look at that list and I'm thinking that's intuitive. It should be plain on its face. I'm a little surprised and shocked that they actually published this list and put it out there.
You know what? It is a little surprising because this is sort of Psych 101. I learned all of these things when I was a first-year psych resident, that you don't prescribe without doing an appropriate evaluation, that you don't prescribe 2 antipsychotics at once, you max out the one antipsychotic dose before you cross-titrate. All of this is really basic psych, and so the reason that it hasn't been written before was because we all learned it back in the day. But what's happened is there's been a complete change in prescribing practices and in the way that psychiatrists more specifically practice. When I first started, a psychiatrist did therapy and medication management. Over the past 20 years, psychiatrists have more branched into just doing medication management, and therapy is done by somebody else.
But the question is, and let me pose this to Matt, why this study at this time, Matt? I'm a little bit of a skeptic. I can toss something at you, but why do you think the APA came out with this at this time?
Well, Christopher, that's a good question. I agree with the good doctor in the respect that I think this is really Psych 101. And I'm not as concerned so much with what the doctors were doing. My focus was what the drug companies were withholding from doctors concerning the types and magnitude and severity of the side effects of some of these antipsychotic drugs.
And again, you're plaintiff's counsel today, but as a defense counsel representing pharmaceutical companies, if they withheld that information, what is your duty as a practitioner?
Well, Chris, I was honored, frankly, and privileged to represent a drug manufacturer, a pharmaceutical company for more than 3 years. At no time in those 3 years did I ever see my client do anything that approached unethical behavior, much less illegal behavior. But now that I've become a plaintiff's counsel and I'm privy to the documents and testimony of a wide array of drug companies, I have seen, unfortunately, many instances where the drug company who controls most of the data and information about a drug has withheld that from prescribing physicians, and it's a travesty.
And so you kind of had your come to Jesus moment once you changed hats or switched hats and did the research.
Well, the come to Jesus moment was when you're representing injured victims and you realize what few options someone has, a family who has a 7-year-old who has been on antipsychotic medications for 2 years and they've grown female breasts. That's the come to Jesus meeting moment when you realize that something wrong has happened and that needs to be stopped.
Hang on, though. Everybody knows that antipsychotics cause gynecomastia. That's not news.
Maybe
it's
you
true.
do, but most of the doctors I know don't seem to know much about it.
Again, you can't pass your boards in
you're
psych
right,
without
Steve.
knowing that.
But what they don't know is the extent to which gynecomastia can happen.
Yeah.
Well, you know
Everyone
what?
knows a lot of people. I'm sorry. A lot of people know it can happen, but what we've found out is drug companies withholding crucial information from prescribers about how often it's happening, and they have a right to know, and their patients have a right to know.
There are
And
a
I think
couple
you would
of
agree with me,
victims
Doctor.
here. The victims are the children who are given these pills. The physicians and psychiatrists are given affirmative false information about the adverse events, and the physicians who aren't told the true story about the adverse events.
So it's across the board.
It's across the board.
Right.
And the physicians
Absolutely.
are sometimes perpetrators because they get paid sometimes to prescribe more drugs, or they get encouraged to think that a particular problem called, for example, bipolar in children, which was created by a Harvard psychiatrist named Biederman, who we've deposed, as you know, and these kids are diagnosed with a psychosis. And that's part of the problem, because it's still in that list of things that the good doctor pointed out. You have to have a diagnosis of psychosis. So they create a psychotic theory. Oh, these kids have bipolar.
Let me let Terry get in
I was
here.
going
Go
to say, I
ahead.
think if you push the blame off on the drug company for hiding information, then you have a problem. So the beginning of the conversation about a drug starts with the information a drug company gives to a doctor that introduces the doctor to the drug. The doctor can't abdicate his responsibility then to look at other avenues for that data. I mean, the test that the drug company does is only one source of data. There's also data that's disclosed to the FDA. There's data that's done by independent researchers that's also available to those doctors.
Right.
So to suggest that the only avenue is the drug company and only what the drug company tells the doctor is a little misleading.
Let me actually ask Matt this question.
I don't. As far as the drug company maintaining control over the information, they are the ones who conducted the test to get the drug approved. And then a lot of times when the drug is on the market, they are the ones who, they may not directly control those post-market studies, but they fund those studies. And they do maintain some control over what's published and what's publicized. And then also you have to keep in mind, drug companies are the ones who send sales reps that literally invade doctors' offices all the time, just inundating them with information that is slanted towards what the drug company wants the doctors to hear. But the overwhelming majority of doctors here are also victims because they've been lied to.
I think that you're correct, that most doctors are victims. The problem you have is sometimes they are major participants, and that small number of doctors that may be participants are the guys that put their name on an article having never seen the data and assuming that they're giving truthful information when they usually often are not.
Wait, I don't want to throw my profession under the bus, but I'm about to do that. Pharmaceutical companies do not have the same relationship with doctors that they used to. Doctors used to get fancy trips, and they used to get tickets to games. Now you're lucky if you get a pen, or you usually get something that's completely useless. Most physicians have to pay for their own CME. It's not like doctors are pawns of the big pharmaceutical companies. This whole big boom in the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, which happened over the past 10 years, is just extraordinary.
Then why was your profession at the forefront of getting these drugs to these kids?
Well, because I think that
Was there a pecuniary interest? I mean, what is it? Were they not informed?
The guy at Harvard, you know, we all think that Harvard is the holy grail, and he was a big name researcher. He was getting a lot of money, and he was publishing in respected peer-reviewed journals the fact that bipolar disorder in children was being underdiagnosed. Now, what he didn't disclose was how much money he was making from the pharmaceutical companies. And really, if you look back at his research, we do not have an objective test for bipolar disorder in children or in adults.
And see, the reason that it's tough to give a pass to the psychiatric profession is I hear psychiatrists saying all the time, gee, like you, we shouldn't be prescribing these to kids. And yet it's been going on and on now for 10 or 15 years.
It has been going on and on, but people have relied upon the peer-reviewed research. And the peer-reviewed research suggested that children were being underdiagnosed. And so if that in fact were true, then we would have a whole group of children who were not receiving an appropriate medical care. Now, I personally believe that there is no evidence, there is no good research behind Biederman's studies that suggested that bipolar disorder was being underdiagnosed. I think that there is a lack of recognition about the difference between, and I hear all the time, the child is psychotic. Well, excuse me, 6- and 7-year-olds still believe in Santa Claus. How are you going to define psychosis in a young child when their reality testing is different than that of an adult? I can't tell you how many parents come into my office and want me to diagnose their kid with ADD or bipolar disorder because they want me to give them a pill. And I won't do that. And so they'll go off and they'll find the next psychiatrist who will. It's like people going to internists with a viral infection and demanding an antibiotic. It's exactly the same thing. You have to be a very strong doctor to put up with the parental pressure day in and day out of people wanting a quick fix.
I think it's good to note that you didn't mention that it was caused by drug companies. Not one of the items you mentioned was it was started by drug companies.
I don't think it was. Well,
Dr.
no.
Biederman,
No, except for
we
Biederman.
deposed him.
Yes.
We deposed him. And he, in his deposition, told us that he got millions of dollars from drug companies.
Yeah, but the profession should have known that.
Well, no, we didn't. No, that isn't reported. Now there are new laws that they're supposed to disclose it. In fact, Harvard gave him, instead of firing him because he brought so much money to the school, they gave him a warning letter not to do it. But he got millions of dollars. The doctors and the psychiatrists and the prescribing community had no idea of that, none, until we deposed him. And during the deposition, we asked him, who's his supervisor? You know what he said?
No one.
God. I mean, the guy, he's
true.
a psychiatrist. He needed one.
I've actually read the deposition. Matt, the sad thing is that a lot of these drugs are now going generic. So even if people are harmed, in a litigation scenario, they're really going to be out of luck here. I know you've written on this comment.
I have it, and this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. Most of us take generic drugs because they're cheaper, and doctors like to prescribe them because they're more affordable for patients. But what most people don't understand is that if they take a generic drug and they suffer some side effect, they basically, as the law currently stands, they have no recourse. Most people don't even realize that if they take a branded drug and they suffer a side effect, the only time that they can sue and try to get some compensation is if the drug company knew or should have known about that side effect and failed to warn about it.
Good luck with that. All right, Matt Harman with Harman Law in Atlanta, Georgia. Thanks for joining us this time, Matt. I'm sure we'll be seeing you again sometime in the near future.
Thanks, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
All
Have a great
take care
night.
now. You could say that this latest American Psychiatric Association Choosing Wisely program is better late than never. But I'm a bit of a skeptic here, Steve. Why this particular publication and why now? And my guess is because the financial incentive has been pulled out. These drugs now are going generic. And let's face it, drug companies are not paying doctors what they have in the past. So what does the American Psychiatric Association have to lose to finally say, long after the barn door should have been shut, we shouldn't be prescribing these drugs to kids. We shouldn't be giving them to the elderly. We should be doing tests first or running a battery of tests before we give them these drugs.
Well, part of the reason, of course, is that we've been, as plaintiffs' lawyers, whistleblower lawyers, we've collected, in my case, probably more than anybody ever, over $4 or $5 billion for the U.S. government because of illegally off-label or misleading information provided by the drug companies. They get tired of paying that, and if they keep doing it, I'm watching them. But there is an important point that Matt made that also affects things. Yes, the generics are there. they've gotten a get out of jail free card from the 5 members of the U.S. Supreme Court that are labeled conservatives, who say you can't sue a generic company for a improper warning unless they didn't copy the exact information on the label of the drug company. There is a problem with that in today's climate of drugs. Many of the companies are requiring their beneficiaries or the patients to fill their prescriptions with generics. Otherwise, they don't pay for them. Secondly, many of the generics are made in foreign countries. India, Rambaxi is a major problem. They've been investigated. The FDA has tried to get in there. Japanese companies have had problems. There is a way that they don't tell you that you can deal with the generic. You can get what's called an authorized generic, which means it's the exact duplicate specifically authorized, like the case of Lipitor in the case of Pfizer.
Terry, go ahead.
Well, look, you raised a couple different issues. The first one is the issue of a warning. If a company does not have the ability to write its own warning, then of course you can't sue the company for failure to warn. They're not the ones who developed it. The FDA requires generic manufacturers to copy the brand label. So it would be unfair to the generics to sue them when they're not the ones who developed the warning. The second issue you raise is about manufacturing defects. Look, if there's a problem at a factory in India that made the drug, well then whoever distributed that drug in the U.S. is liable for it. So there is a recourse for that kind of problem. So don't suggest to these folks that there is no recourse, because there is.
So where does this leave us now in litigation? I mean, you could say, Terry, that if the pharmaceutical companies are as bad as Steve is alleging and doctors are as bad as Dr. Ziv is saying, is that maybe they paid the price. I mean, the settlements that we've seen in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years total in the billions of dollars, whether they're fair or not. Someone could say they've paid the piper.
Well, if you're talking about the whistleblower type litigation, I think if you look at those cases, 90% of those cases in those recent settlements are about conduct that occurred 2007 and before. That I think the doctor made that comment earlier, that's not the environment that we have today, by and large. I don't want to be a generalist, but by and large, that's not the environment we have. Either these companies have corporate compliance agreements, or they've instituted their own internal ethical guidelines to guide that process. So we're going to continue to see whistleblower cases, but I don't think we're going to continue to see the big verdicts. Now,
I don't think it has much to do with the fact that these drugs have gone generic and now there's really no cause of action.
I don't think so. I don't think so, because we're still going to have litigation, and it's still the cases are still going to be about did the appropriate warning accompany that drug so that the doctor knew what the potential adverse reactions could be, and then did the doctor have the right conversation with the patient?
Steve and Doc Ziv, I know you've both been involved in Risperdal, which again is an antipsychotic produced by Janssen, but there are other antipsychotics out there, Geodon, Seroquel, Abilify. We've seen most of them in play in major litigation, but you see up on the screen right now there's a commercial for Abilify. It is the leading selling drug in the United States today. It's an antipsychotic. We've seen most of these antipsychotics in litigation, but Abilify, oddly enough, really has ducked under the radar. Use that phrase again. Why is it?
Risperdal. And the reason...
No. Risperdal hasn't. You've got hundreds of cases, PI cases, mass tort cases, and you just won a $2.2 billion whistleblower case. I don't think that's flying under the radar. But Abilify has not been hit with those kind of numbers. Doc, do you have any guesses? And we'll go back to Steve.
Abilify is probably used less frequently than Risperdal is.
But I've got to imagine people are walking into your office, and before they sit down, they say, "Doc, I'd like my kid," or "I would like to have Abilify."
Well, first
Come on,
of all,
they see the commercials.
There are certain habits of prescribing, and I will say that kids get prescribed Risperdal more frequently than they get prescribed Abilify, probably because there is a wider dosage range for Risperdal than there is for Abilify.
It may be more because Risperdal somehow or other got the FDA to approve its use for autistic children. Abilify doesn't have that approval. It never should have been approved for children. It has an important difference and much greater danger than Abilify, if you really want to know, and that is that it increases your weight, which is the others do. Abilify may not do it as much. But most important of all, it increases in children what's called the hormone prolactin. to a greater extent than any other drug of this type.
And that's
Yeah, but that's a
ergo the
temporary
gynecomastia.
thing.
And that's where they come from, gynecomastia. That drug should never, never, never be prescribed to a child.
I don't think that the distinction between Risperdal and Abilify, or Abilify and Seroquel, or Zyprexa, or Geodon, I don't think that they're, first of all, that dramatic. Second of all, most of these side effects, with the exception of tardive dyskinesia, which is a potentially lifelong side effect that theoretically happens less frequently in the newer antipsychotics, the hyperprolactinemia, which causes lactation and gynecomastia, goes away once you take away the drug. So
I've
the
got dozens of
gynecomastia
kids who
might
had
not
double
go.
mastectomies.
Pardon me.
I
Depends on how long that they how long they're on it.
Yeah.
And it depends on the kid. But obesity can cause gynecomastia too. And
Obesity combined with Risperdal, the combination of those two together is like a perfect storm. You don't add the obesity problem and mix it with Risperdal.
Otherwise, young men
And then
can grow
kids
breasts.
in puberty,
Right.
increases the risk. So what you do is you want to avoid that.
well, one of the things, though, that I think is missing from this conversation is the relative rarity of the side effects, or serious side effects. Number one, I do think that the psychiatric community has been remiss in not holding their own experts and researchers to a higher standard. I think that the fact that Biederman is still on faculty, which I believe he is at
Yes, he
Harvard,
is.
it blows my mind that the entire psychiatric community was led astray. And even after it was all uncovered, we didn't go back and look and say, hey, maybe we really need to rethink this diagnosis of bipolar disorder in kids. I mean, where is the evidence for it, and how is it persisting? And by the way, I know that we're talking about it from a medical point of view and a legal point of view and a lawsuit point of view. I'm a psychiatrist. I think about it from a psychiatric point of view and a psychological point of view. What does it say to these kids that they're getting this lifelong diagnosis for behaviors that they might not have any control over, that might be related to their family dynamic, their parenting, but they are being labeled as seriously mentally ill. Sometimes they're hospitalized. Often they're hospitalized when they're put on an antipsychotic medication.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
I think the doctor's point about the low incidence of side effects is a good one. And I think, you know, Steve, you gave a nice talk about when the drug should be prescribed and what the dangerous side effects are. Very detailed analysis as a doctor, and that's what makes you a great attorney. But the FDA analyzes this data across the spectrum of patients who get the drug, and that's where they make the decision about what population should the drug be prescribed for. They don't, and they can't look at it per patient. That analysis is for the doctor to make, in which patient, which is the analysis you gave, which is the perfect one for the doctor to make, not the FDA and not the drug company.
Let me ask the $64,000 question, because we really haven't asked, and I want to go around the panel here. Did the lawsuits that we've seen in the last 10 years, and again, Steve, you've been involved in some of those, do you think that has been behind, at least partially, changing the behavior of pharmaceutical companies and psychiatrists?
Yes, and we've gotten information. Most of these companies are under corporate integrity agreements so that if they get caught again, they're in deeper trouble. The other thing that's very interesting about, say, Risperdal, do you know that the drug is not approved for children in Canada at all, but is approved here? What is it about Canada's FDA that is different about the US FDA? I think the FDA here has to examine its moral compass. They are not adequately protecting the public. Not adequately protecting the public.
How have lawyers affected this, do you think? What do you think the litigation has done regarding pharmaceutical companies' behaviors, doctors' behaviors, lawyer behaviors? What impact has it had?
I think the whistleblower lawsuits have been a wake-up call, and not necessarily in the sense that Steve might suggest, but what's at risk in those whistleblower lawsuits is that if those cases go to trial and a drug company is found guilty, they lose the ability to get a Medicare reimbursement, and that's pretty important. So, you know, they look at those cases, they evaluate the evidence, and in some respects, they want to comply. I mean, they want to do the right thing. So it's not a huge push to get those corporate integrity agreements in place. As far as the product liability litigation, I don't think that's played a huge role. The companies, again, they want to do the right thing. They want to help patients, and they'll continue to operate and get drugs out into the field that are needed.
And Doc, let's finish with you tonight. We've seen that there are big changes with ProPublica and watchdog groups taking a look at how many dollars and publishing the amounts that those doctors receive from pharmaceutical companies. I think between that and lawyers, generic drugs, and maybe the lack of financial incentive may finally be changing things in your profession. What do you think?
I think that you're totally overstating the role of litigation in prescribing practices.
You don't think that they've been frightened? You don't think these big drug companies have been frightened at all by 1.6, 2.2, 2.3 billion? I mean, is it really that much of a drop in the bucket?
Well, you're making an association that I'm not willing to make. You're making these, yes, I think it has totally changed the practice of pharmaceutical companies. It has changed the relationship between pharmaceutical companies and physicians.
That's all I was asking, really.
Right. I don't think that it has. And by the way, I want to point out the whole black box warning issue that occurred for we're talking about antipsychotics, but let's talk about the use of antidepressants in this population in kids. So they came out, the FDA came out with the black box warning that said that you're going to have increased suicidal behavior or suicidal ideation in teens and young adults. First of all, it's an absurd concept, as if there's some receptor for suicidality that disappears after you're 25. Second of all, research after the black box warning, and the prescription rate stayed about the same. The prescriptions increased of antidepressants prior to the black box warning. After the black box warning, it stayed relatively the same. However, there has been no overall increase in suicide rates after the black box warning. So we have this big reaction to litigation, and that all came about. The black box warning for antidepressants came about as a result of litigation.
And what do you think? And what do you think about ProPublica and other watchdog groups that are reporting how many dollars psychiatrists and other MDs are receiving from the pharmaceutical industry? Is that changing behavior? I think it is.
I think it's changing research, and I think it's changing the way that we evaluate research. It's not changing the average Joe on the street psychiatrist practice. So the average psychiatrist goes to a CME, wherever it is, at Harvard, at the APA, wherever it is, and they learn from the panel of experts about what the current literature says. To the extent that these new disclosures now make us look at the literature more carefully, and that people have to disclose their relationships, that's going to change what the average psychiatrist learns at these meetings, and that's going to change their prescribing practices.
We're not going to get any dispositive answers tonight, but I do love the conversation. Stephen Scheller joining us tonight, plaintiff's attorney with Scheller PC in Philadelphia. Stephen practiced since 1977, representing those who have been injured by dangerous drugs and pharmaceutical whistleblower litigation, especially over the last decade. Dr. Barbara Ziv joining us tonight, forensic psychiatrist on the faculty at Temple University Medical School, who speaks and lectures extensively, as you can probably imagine, about the overprescription of medication, especially for children. And Terry Henry, returning to our set from Blank Rome, our commercial litigator for the defense, representing medical device and pharmaceutical companies. Terry, thanks for being here. For all of us here at the American Law Journal, thanks for joining us this week. Till next Monday night, case closed.
This week's American Law Journal has been made possible in part by Scheller PC, protecting consumer rights since 1977. Blank Rome, providing strategic advice for employers in today's workplace. And The Legal Intelligencer, the nation's oldest legal newspaper for lawyers.